We introduced the story of Ruth last week in Ruth chapter 1. Now, the story of Ruth kind of encapsulates quite a bit, actually. That this kind of teeny tiny little story, if we remember, sits between a few giants. The Old Testament book of Judges, again, where the story of Judges is where basically everyone was doing as they pleased. A lot of sinfulness, a lot of crazy things going on, and it was including these quote unquote judges whom were leading Israel at the time. So it's crammed between that book and the book of 1 Samuel, where, again, the revered prophet Samuel anointed the two very first kings of Israel. Because, again, well, the people, well, they wanted a king, right? They wanted a king because, in a way, God was a little too unseen for that time. So they wanted kind of a human to basically lead them. In the ways, hopefully in the theoretical ways of the Lord. But of course, it doesn't always work out that way. So again, the story of Ruth is kind of crammed between, right in the middle of these two giant narratives about Israel's history, about a lot of sinfulness, a lot of mistakes, a lot of violence, a lot of war. And it's my belief that this little story that was crammed between these two big narratives it was meant to be that to remind us that in the midst of uncontrollable chaos, crazy times, going on in the world, especially in the biblical times at that moment, and I'd argue even now, right, in our modern time here now, that God still calls his people to be kind, okay, to forgive, to not succumb to the pressures of society, right? To show mercy and to be empathetic, especially to the cause of others that are deemed different than us. Okay. Now, I wanted to quote this book that I've been reading. I know I mentioned it last time too. It's called Borders and Belonging. It was written by our two Irish friends, right? Our two Irish theologians named Glenn Jordan and Padraig Tuama. Okay. It's one of the better books that I've read in a while concerning the book of Ruth. And they say this about the book of Ruth. And I quote, "The book of Ruth appears as a brief interlude between tales of war and empire building, offering us respite in a story of love and loyalty." So again, this book appears between, a lot of just crazy things going on in our world to kind of remind us as readers that love and loyalty still matter, right? That God calls us to be those things. Now, as promised, for us visual learners, we're going to take a look at a video from the Bible Project. Again, wonderful resource about anything Bible related that will give you great context in terms of, what was kind of going on behind the scenes or behind the curtain in these books of the Bible that we do read. So now, we're going to look at a video about the book of Ruth and its first two chapters, and we'll have a conversation after. So, enjoy the video.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, But Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family.
Now, the book of Ruth also begins a process of challenging stereotypes. Now, I know I mentioned this last time, and it begins a process of challenging stereotypes by kind of inviting us as hearers or readers, basically, to consider the possibility of a new story in the relationship between these people. Now, again, if you remember, last time we talked about this family fleeing Bethlehem because of famine, right? Famine means no food or water or sustenance, right? To go to Moab, right? And, that was seen as a foolish act to go into quote unquote enemy territory or a place where there was kind of tension and hostility. It was compounded by, another foolish act where marrying these boys to Moabite women, right, can only end in heartbreak because, in the stereotypes of the story world being explored, there's only one way that this ends, right? Where these scheming, manipulative Moabite women cannot remain faithful. That's impossible, right? In this stereotypical world of the Moabite women. And then, death comes because, that's what happens when you marry a Moabite woman. You die, right? And that's what happened, right, in the story, right, with Naomi's two sons, Naomi and Elimelech's two sons, is that they both died along with Naomi's husband, right? So, to take this point further, hospitable Moabites in this time, again, stereotypically, did not exist. Faithful and good Moabite women were unknown, okay? Now, in fact, there's actually a law in the Bible that says this, right, that proves this point. In Deuteronomy 23, starting at 3, the scripture says this: no Ammonite or Moabite, right? Moabite, that's what we're talking about here. No Ammonite or Moabite shall come into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall come into the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. That's pretty striking, okay? You can see the hostility, right, and the tension between these two people groups, right? Now, to quote Glenn Jordan and Padraig Tuama again from our book, Borders and Belonging, because of what your people did to our people back in the time when we've forgotten who started what, we hold this against you today, right, in terms of stereotypes. It is a repeated story because of what X did to Y. It is repeated because it is powerful. And Ruth is walking into a time warp where what was done in the mythologized past is remembered in the real present. And what is remembered is re-remembered, so she, in the membership of her own body, is a blank canvas upon which hate-filled histories hang. So we see, again, if we pull back the curtain in this story a little bit, you see the ugliness of these stereotypes, what kind of goes on in the minds of, the Jewish people or the people of Israel when they think about these people from Moab, right? And those were the stereotypes, right? Especially with the women, right? That's why they're so against even bringing in people from Moab into, even into the borders of Israel, and there we mess with their women, right? Kind of idea. But here, the audience, meaning us, has been invited in a way to consider the possibility that their inherited, maybe their and our inherited assumptions just might be wrong, and that real change was actually possible. Imagine that, right? So maybe there's something to be said about this book and stereotypes as it relates to today too, right? Think stereotypes of what's going on today, right? Maybe our inherited stereotypes and our inherited assumptions just might be wrong, right? Now, let's take a closer look at the scripture at hand. We'll be spending time in Ruth chapter 2. We'll be jumping over. We won't read the entire chapter in its entirety, but I encourage us to read it as well. I'll spotlight a few verses here. Ruth chapter 2, starting at 1, says this. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side. Basically, a kinsman is the next of kin that through the law was supposed to take care of the family, kind of thing. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite, again, it's Ruth the Moabite. She's just not Ruth, but she's Ruth the Moabite. To, again, feature that she is a foreigner from a place like Moab. So that's how she is named, and that's how she is recognized in this scripture. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." In these few verses, we learn a little bit about this man in question named Boaz, right? And he seems to be a very, very good man with high standing, and he happened to be rich. Perfect gentleman. And also, he's related to Naomi's late husband too. How about that? A little bit about gleaning, okay? Gleaning, back in biblical times, is a practice of allowing the poor, particularly widows, orphans, and foreigners, to collect leftover crops, like grain, grapes, and olives, from the edges of harvested fields and from vineyards and olive trees. So if you can imagine a harvested field, the edges back in this time were meant for the poor, widows, orphans, foreigners, right? This wasn't just something that they did. This was actually a legal right that was established by God's law in the Old Testament, particularly in the Old Testament books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, as kind of a form of social welfare, ensuring that even marginalized people, hence the poor, widows, foreigners, etc., right, that even them could earn their food and maintain dignity through work, rather than just relying solely on the goodwill and charity of others, right? That they could actually work for their food. Imagine that, right? There's an old adage that goes, a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous, All right, I'll read that one more time. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. Now, in this second act of this story of Ruth, Ruth goes out to glean barley to sustain herself and Naomi, okay? Because, well, they have to eat. They have to eat. Remember, Naomi's coming in as a vulnerable widow. What we know about widows in this time is that they were cast off without their husband. So she was hanging on by a thread with a foreigner young woman in Naomi, or in Ruth, I'm sorry, in tow. So there was not a whole lot going on for both of them societally at that time. Why? Because, well, Ruth was from Moab, and Moab was kind of not a good place for people to come, right? Kind of idea, right? So again, they were not in the best scenario, I guess, in terms of how would they sustain themselves. So Ruth goes out to glean barley, which again is a legal right established by God's law, right? For people just like Ruth, right? And well, what ends up happening is that, well, it just as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to a man named Boaz. And well, Boaz just so happened to be a pillar of the community, right? Whose name is attached to one of the pillars of the temple even, right? A wonderful man, but he also just happens by chance, to be related to Naomi's dead husband. Funny how things work out sometimes, right? Funny. Now, if you remember, last time we talked about how in the book of Ruth, God is mentioned, but he doesn't speak, right? God does not speak, again, from burning bushes in this book, nor does God divide the sea, right? Instead, well, we see God acting through circumstance and through the faithfulness of very, very, very ordinary human beings, like you and us. God's hesed as a complicated Hebrew word with a simple English translation. Think steadfast love, or love that lasts, or a love that's loyal. God's hesed is embodied in human action. Boaz, in the story then, asks Ruth, "Who are you? Where and who did you come here, or who brought you here?" To which Boaz, the people, tells them, well, she is from Moab, and she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. To which Boaz, being the wonderful man that he is, despite, again, the stereotypes attached to that country and people, he keeps an eye on her. Right? And he tells her this, right? In Ruth 2, verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young man not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young man have drawn." Verse 10. Then she, Ruth, fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" Because most landowners in this time did not treat foreigners, especially from Moab, like that. Verse 11. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." What we do, what we say, again, does matter. It does, right? And this is a circumstance into which God is leaning into, right? And these writers, ancient writers, are leaning into, is that what we do and what we say ultimately matters. It does, okay? It has to. And then finally, when Ruth got home to her mother-in-law after a day of gleaning and work, in Ruth 2, starting at 19, it says this: her mother-in-law said to her, Naomi said to Ruth, "So, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she, being Ruth, told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, saying, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness, right? Remember that word kindness, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, The man is a relative of ours. That's an interesting way that Naomi said this, okay? The man, Boaz, is a relative of ours, meaning her and Ruth are connected now, right? They have a bond. Ruth is they're not blood related here, okay? Her son died. She has no real loyalty, or she doesn't have to take care of Ruth. But through the circumstance, Naomi revealed a lot about her character in that, hey, we're now together in this together. We might not be related by blood, but we're family now. Okay? The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin. Then Ruth the Moabite said, He even said to me, Stay close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. Naomi sees the astonishing amount of barley that Ruth has gleaned. A lot. They have food now. And finds out that it is Boaz that had helped Ruth. And it is only then that Naomi begins to move from hopelessness and despair, bitterness, remember? She changed her name to Bitter, right there. She changed her name to Mara, to that of hope. Right, to that of hope. She recognizes in this turn of events the hand of God, and she is quick to name God as the source of blessing. Blessed be he, being Boaz, by the Lord, whose kindness, remember, that's the word hesed, right? The steadfast love, or a love that's loyal, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So now, in that response, we see the tide turning now, okay? What was once empty, that she brought back into home, or Judah, right, from Moab with Naomi, is being filled, right? Probably not the way she planned it. With her husband and 2 sons dead, but with a daughter-in-law she has in tow, right? That emptiness is being filled now. Hope is alive and is being brought up. Hope is born. And it is an old widow, one who has seen more than her share of sorrow in her life. Can anyone relate with that? Right? Who recognizes the hand of God in these seemingly happenstance circumstances. Right? Perhaps it is often thus those who have had long experience of seeing God at work can recognize and name those times in our lives when actual miracles begin to happen. So again, in this story, it's a story about us in a lot of ways, right? There's not a whole lot of, extracurricular or supernatural occurrences. I mean, that does happen in the Bible. But in this teeny tiny little story, we see God working through circumstance, right? We see him working through the love and loyalty they have for one another as an example of his love and loyalty to his people, right? So again, this teeny tiny little story surrounded in the Bible by a lot of crazy occurrences, stories, and war and killing and, kings and judges, right? We come upon this little story that reminds us of our own humanity. Our humanity as people, that we are all interconnected in some way, that God is reaching out and encouraging us to look ourselves in the mirror and look at the stereotypes that society has around us and say, hey, wait a minute. Let's actually get to know the people first, right? Let's put a face to it. So then therefore, again, we see the world through the lens of what God sees, okay? And not through our own biases or stereotypes, not like that, but to see beyond those things, right? And look at them as a child of God. I pray that we'd be able to see God in the circumstances of our lives right now. that God ultimately wants the best for us, that there is hope being born right around the corner. And it's with our eyes that we get to see this happen in real life. So I pray that we be open to this idea, and that this, again, this little tiny little story will remind us of our own humanities here, right? We're all in this together. So may it be our own communities here, the ones that are maybe in our family units, but also our greater communities that we live in, our state, our counties, country, and our world, right? This is what it is. We're all connected in some kind of way. I pray that the story remind us of that simple fact, that humanity, as we know, are in this together. So again, I pray that we would have this perspective and that we could take it with us wherever we go, so that God can't only bless us, but we can be a blessing to those around us as well.